Dementia changes so much memory, language, expressions, roles within a family. And for the people who love someone living with dementia, grief can begin long before someone passes away. We can find ourselves missing someone who is still sitting beside us, trying to make sense of what has happened while holding tightly to what hasn't. And sometimes we don't even have the words for what we're experiencing. My guest today is Cindy Weinstein. She is the Eli and Edythe Board Professor of English at the California Institute of Technology and an Atlantic Fellow for Equity and Brain Health. But today you're also going to meet Cindy as a daughter. Her dad, Jerry, was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease in his mid-50s when Cindy was just 25, and decades later, she returned to that experience to write Finding the Right Words, a story of literature, grief, and the brain with renowned neurologist Dr. Bruce Miller. Cindy brings together the lived experience of being a daughter, her life's work in literature, and a study of neuroscience to help us understand not only what dementia does to the brain, but what it can do to the relationship and to the person who is loving someone through it. And now her work extends beyond the book, and she is leading a support group through Hilarity for Charity, keeping each other company, caregiving, and grief as we create space for caregivers to talk about grief and loneliness and love and all of the complicated emotions that don't have an easy place to go. And in this conversation, we talk about anticipatory grief and why certain moments stay frozen in time. We talk about what learning the science of the brain gave Cindy decades after her father's diagnosis. We talk about memory and words and identity, and the question underneath so much of dementia caregiving. When so much about a person changes, what does remain? And one of the things that I loved most about this conversation is that Cindy doesn't try to give us a formula for grief. She doesn't try to fix it. She gives us permission to sit with it and to keep loving and to keep remembering the whole person and maybe to find some words that we've been searching for all along. Here is my conversation with Cindy Weinstein. It's a joy to finally be able to have a visit with you, and I'm so grateful you're here. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Nicole. It's an honor to be here.
When we hear other people share, it gives us words to our own emotions and our own thoughts that are so vital as we move forward and navigate grief and loss and change and everything that happens in our life. So I am so grateful you're here. And I know that we will learn from you and we will change our perspective because of what you share. So I'm grateful to you. And I would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started. We're going to dive in and have some deeper discussion.
I am a mom of two children and a dog, and my husband, Jim. And I am a professor at the California Institute of Technology, which was the first job I took out of graduate school at Berkeley. And I've spent my career at Caltech studying and writing about and teaching US literature. In particular, the area of study I'm most interested in is 19th century US literature and culture, and even more particularly Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass, etc. So I have written several books, and the one we're talking about today is unusual in that it's a memoir, and my other books are much more straightforwardly academic.
Mm. It makes sense. Reading your reading your book, it was just you painted such beautiful pictures of feelings and words and emotions. And so I encourage everyone to read, but also dive into the other work that you're doing. So
Thank
it's so
you.
wonderful. It's
Thank
so
you.
wonderful. I want to start where we get to hear more about before the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. You know, it's never the beginning of someone's story.
Right,
And you even include that in part of your book of remembering your
right.
dad. And so tell us about your dad. Who was he? What made you a daddy's girl?
My dad's name was Gerald Weinstein, and he always made sure to say Gerald with a J, and he went by Jerry. And he also, in high school, was a basketball player, and his nickname was the Machine. And I have a picture of my dad in his basketball garb as the Machine. And he was just incredibly generous, loving, um, open-minded individual who gave me love with no conditions
Mm,
whatsoever. My mother too, but we're talking about my dad.
yeah.
And what made me a daddy's girl, I was definitely a tomboy. I was the youngest of three. My older sister, who died several years ago, my brother, and myself. So I was the youngest, and my brother wasn't really into sports very much. So I had to fill in the gap. And what that meant was really just watching sports a lot with my dad and knowing football inside out, knowing basketball, going to the Knick games with him at Madison Square Garden. I loved going to the office with him. That was a real treat. He had an electrical supply warehouse. They don't really have those anymore. It's sort of more Lowe's and Home Depot.
Mhm.
And he ran that. It was called Apex Electrical Supply with my Uncle Bernie. And dad was just such a people person. And one of the things I talk about, we would go out to dinner. Dad would take the three kids out for dinner. My mom would go to the Y. And every Tuesday night we'd go out for dinner, and it was my sister, my brother, and myself and dad. And then Linda went off to college, and then it was just Lyle, my brother, and myself. And then Lyle went off to college. And there was a 6 year gap between me and Lyle. And then it was dad and I going out for dinner every Tuesday night, and we would go, and he would just know someone, always know someone, and chit chat and sort of, do the room. And people just loved him. And he
Mm,
was so generous. I keep using that word.
mm,
And he gave me so much.
mhm. You shared one of his letters in the book too. And when I was reading that, I loved how he was also so expressive of how he had gratitude for you and the person that you are. It is when you encounter people that are like that, you realize how many people are not. And there's the contrast of for someone to freely share and express love and thankfulness and see who you are and make a point to encourage you. It is such a gift. And as a parent to a child, it shapes us and just to have so much gratitude around that. So lucky, lucky.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning the letter.
Mhm,
I talk about what those letters that I wrote to my dad meant to me.
mhm, mhm,
Less, I guess the whole book is kind of like what his letters to me
mm,
meant. And
mhm,
hit the nail on the head.
mm,
Just being seen,
mhm,
um, and uh, just being loved for who I was. There's
mhm.
nothing better.
Yeah. Ah, so true. And I know
Yeah.
we're going to talk more about that love when we look at that 30 years have passed and you've built this beautiful career and a family and written books, and that there is still a part of you, still 25 years old, right? Standing in Berkeley when your mom called.
Right.
And when you think of those certain um, moments,
Mhm.
how has that in some ways caregiving, right, becomes frozen in time? Do you still have remember how you felt, what you were wearing, any of those details where it does sit with us. It changes, right? It shifts those moments in time.
right. I don't use the word trauma in the
Mm,
book, but I think that was a moment for
mm,
sure. And I was sitting in my little apartment in Berkeley. I don't remember what I was wearing, but it was evening.
mm,
And I was reading a Puritan sermon, Jonathan
mm,
Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And the phone rang, and my mother told me what the diagnosis was.
mm,
And it was an earthquake in my soul,
mm,
even though I didn't know what was coming. I knew it was going to be bad.
mm,
And my mom, I remember, indicated that, and this is my mom trying to protect me
mm,
from life. She said, I was really hoping not to tell you until you graduated from Berkeley, because
mm,
she thought I wouldn't be able to finish my PhD knowing that my dad was sick. I mean, there was some magical thinking going on, and Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, I think, is the greatest, most profound book on grief that I've read,
mm,
and inspired my own thinking about grief. My mom seemed to think that I wouldn't know that something was deeply wrong.
mm,
I I knew before she told me the diagnosis that dad had changed in ways that I didn't understand.
mhm,
And I think my mom was very much in protective mode and knew how much I loved reading and how committed I was to getting my PhD. And my mom and dad really wanted me to do that. And she was just worried that I was just gonna stop.
mm,
Um, and I did stop in one way and then kept going in another way.
mm,
And the memoirs about that experience of occupying two very different, in literary criticism, temporalities, being 25 and then life moving forward.
mm. Yeah.
Um, and just sort of the difficulty I
Mhm,
had in um, splitting off in that way,
mhm.
and then knowing I needed to come together. I needed to come
Right,
back together.
right. Yeah. You just had mentioned that you don't use the word trauma, but
Yeah,
in that moment, and in some ways, that is what trauma can do, is we can have that splitting off, right? Of
right,
we have to keep moving forward, yet we know internally we are carrying so much. And
right.
it's very interesting how our response that we are able to do that, right? When you
Right.
look at
Yeah.
things that can happen. Uh, I want to also share before I ask you this question around love, you had spent a year studying neurology, so I want to hear about that.
Okay.
And you still shared, I can't tell this story alone, and that in a way is acknowledging that you want to have some support in that. And you partnered with Dr. Bruce Miller and to have this book become what it is, right? Could not have been with just one voice. And I want to hear more about that progression of how that came to be, your studying neurology, and then your decision to partner in writing this book.
Okay. I'll try and remember all those questions,
Yeah.
but
I can bring
no,
them up
it's
again.
great. It's great. I wanted to write a book about my dad with a doctor, a scientist, a researcher.
Mhm.
I wanted to do it for academic reasons because I didn't just want to tell the story of my family's grief and my father. I wanted it to speak to a larger readership. That was very
Mhm.
important to me. And I thought the way to do that was to have someone who could talk about the neurology behind what are called the clinical presentations that I was
Mhm.
seeing, whether that was my dad being depressed, whether that was my dad not finding a word, whether that was my dad aiming the golf club in the wrong direction. I
Mhm.
wanted to find someone, a researcher, a doctor, who could explain to readers what was happening in my dad's brain or
Mhm.
not happening in my dad's brain. So there
Mhm.
was a there was an academic sort of reason behind it, but there was also an emotional one. And that has to do with feeling very alone in the experience of my grief with my dad. Now, my husband was spectacular. It wasn't that I didn't talk about it. My friends were there, but it's so lonely. And I remember, and I've talked to other caregivers about this, and I should also say I never thought of myself as a caregiver, and we can talk about that if you want. But there's only so often you can talk about how sad you are,
So true.
right? And that's why it's so important to me to do support groups, to do
Mm.
outreach, because I think often it's easier to talk to a stranger than to someone you really love and someone you want to take care of. And you don't want to
Mhm.
inflict your sorrow on them all the time. And
So
so
true.
you kind of protect them and
Mhm.
go inward, and then you're lonely.
Yeah.
And I felt very lonely when I was going through it. And I knew that writing the book was going to be really hard,
Mm.
emotionally really hard. And I wanted to find a doctor who
Mhm.
was also empathic and a good
Mm.
writer. There were a lot of
Mm.
requirements.
Yes.
And so I found Bruce. It took me 10 years. I cycled through a few neurologists who were interested in the project but didn't have time. And then I had an idea for another academic book. And
Mhm.
then I found out about this interdisciplinary program at the Memory and Aging Center at UCSF. One of the neurologists directed me to Bruce. I sent him an email. We met, completely hit it off. He said to me, "Do you want to learn some science?" I was like,
Mm.
"Yes." I had this intuition that the science would help. I think that
Mm.
is a function of teaching at Caltech, which is
Mm.
very STEM oriented.
Mhm.
And I applied to this Global Brain Health Initiative program where I got to study neurology for a year
Wow.
and met with Bruce once a month to talk about the chapters. And that's
Wow.
what it came to be.
So incredible.
Thank you.
And when we are in those moments of grief and trying to understand what is happening to our person, there is a level of when we learn and can know and take some of the mystery, is that the right word?
Mhm.
We can have a little bit more peace, and it just gives more understanding to what we may be experiencing. And I feel like, even with the title, Finding the Right Words, it isn't necessarily about having this better vocabulary,
Right.
but how do we find language to experiences that we often don't have words for? You talk about sharing grief and how many, how do we even explain that or articulate that? And for a lot of caregivers, I think that we have so many complex emotions and that we don't even know how to explain what is
Mm.
happening internally with our loved ones. Uh, how do we communicate that to people that don't understand what's going on?
Right,
And how do we describe grief, all of these things that we have to work through. And so having it grounded in science gives a little bit more weight or meat to what is happening from that perspective. But then it also, the evolution of being able to probably dialogue with him helped
right.
you even articulate and have emotion and words towards those things that are happening. Yeah.
Absolutely. Because when my dad was diagnosed in the 80s, it was Alzheimer's. There was
Mm,
no precision diagnosis.
hmm.
And the moment that Bruce gave me a full diagnosis was unreal.
Wow.
I was sitting with him in his office and he's like, okay, talk to me about your dad. And I did. And I said, there are no MRIs, no PETs. It's
Mhm.
just me telling you what
Mhm.
I experienced. And he wanted to know how old my dad was. He was in his 50s when he was diagnosed.
Mhm.
And he wanted to know what the original symptom was, which was hard for me to get to because I think there were two major ones. But I said word finding, and
Mhm.
he said, I think your dad had early onset Alzheimer's, which is early onset means 65 or younger. Early onset Alzheimer's with the logopenic variant, which
Mhm.
is a rare variant that has to do with word finding as opposed to, although this happened as well, attacking the memory center, which is the
Mhm.
hippocampus. And I use these words because one of the one of the motivations for writing the book, there were many,
Mhm.
but I really wanted caregivers and families and people with dementia to have some vocabulary so when they go to the doctor's office
Mhm.
and are confronted with this life-changing diagnosis,
Mhm.
that they have some of the words that the doctor is going to tell them.
Right.
So I wanted them to know hippocampus, cortex, or, all those
Mhm.
words because it just, I think, is a form of empowerment. So
Yes.
there's a glossary at the end of the book that was very important to me and Bruce so that caregivers and their loved ones could could know what words they might be dealt with when
Yes.
they go to the doctor.
Yes. I noticed that. And I was, in fact, going to mention the glossary is at the end, which I will be referencing also.
Okay.
Yes, I have, as you see me looking over to the side, I have the book here.
Uh-huh.
And your conversation or when Bruce writes about, and I'm going to read a little bit of it.
Uh-huh.
He says she notes if someone remembers having loved you, is that the same as them loving you? Later, she goes on, I say he loved me, but really what I mean is that I think on some level he remembered that I was someone he had loved. Even if he didn't know exactly who I was, he knew I was someone who had mattered to him once upon a time. And he goes on to write, her comment is profound, and many caregivers think about similar ideas, sometimes in an agonizing fashion. Another question that the reader might ask is, does Cindy's love for her father before Alzheimer's disease help him cope with his Alzheimer's disease? Of course, there's no absolute answer, but it won't surprise the reader to know that I have my own opinion that is anatomical. Oh my gosh, I don't even know if I can pronounce this word. Phena, n- can you help me with that?
What
Phena,
page are you on? I'm not sure what page you're
I'm
on.
on page 72 and I don't want to get it wrong. That's why phenom not not
Oh,
yeah.
phenomenological. to
There we go.
non-neurological.
There we
Yeah,
go. And I'm
yeah.
not going to edit this out because our
Okay.
listeners can say, "Oh, yeah, I
Um,
might struggle with that word too." And strongly rooted in behavioral neurology principles.
mhm,
But really looking at that
mhm,
and knowing that because what we do know to be true is while we might have lost words or a loved one might have lost the words,
right,
we can feel that that feeling is there, right? And they can pick up on
right,
facial expression and feeling, and
right.
that's there.
Yeah.
And so, what does that, when I read that back, what does that
Mhm.
mean to you today? Have you had reflection around that or that dynamic with your dad?
My answer goes back to your previous question about
Mm,
words and the irony of writing this book called Finding the Right Words, and you kind of
mhm,
alluded to it,
mhm.
is the irrelevance of words.
Yeah.
As you can tell, like I love words, even bad
Mm,
words, early onset Alzheimer's with the logopenic variant. Nobody wants to know those words, right?
mhm,
Um, but they were very empowering in a way because it was like, oh, that's why my dad couldn't
mm,
do this or
mhm,
that, right? But
mhm,
then when you read that passage, I remember when I was younger in the earlier stages of my dad's illness, I felt that his growing inability to use language, and I write about this, it made me feel like I didn't exist,
mm,
that he didn't, and it's all so me, which is why
mhm,
studying neurology was so important because it turned it from me to my dad. So it
mhm,
was my brain going over the same things over and over again, but it was my dad's brain.
mm,
That's where the focus needed to be. And
mhm,
it finally was there, and that was good.
mhm,
But that passage that you read, that was a reflection that I got to many years after his death. That
mm,
it didn't matter that he didn't know that I was Cindy. It totally didn't matter.
mm,
What mattered was the muscle memory, that when I went in to embrace him, maybe he couldn't embrace me back, but he knew that I was someone he could trust to hold him, to
mhm.
touch him. And ultimately, that's what matters.
Right, right.
That's what
It is.
matters.
Yeah, it is. And one of the things that I was noticing reading was that similarly of just sharing
Mhm,
and leaning in on what matters. You never were rescuing people, the readers, from the grief, but gently walking beside them in it.
mhm,
And I do believe that that's what caregivers actually need, right? Not to
mhm,
fix someone's pain,
mhm,
but to stay with them in it. And I want to hear your thoughts on how you decided to lean into that way
mhm.
rather than fixing it for them.
Right,
I know, we want to fix things and take
right,
that grief away, but where was
right.
your
The book is not a how-to book,
Mhm,
right? It gives information about dementia, but I do not think, one, that I know how to fix anyone else's grief. I
mhm,
barely know how to fix my own. And I
mhm,
also think that everyone's experience is really different. And
mhm,
so I didn't want to presume
mhm,
to know how to fix grief. And the support group that I do through Hilarity for Charity is called Keeping Each Other Company, Caregiving and Grief.
mhm,
And I think that kind of captures my approach, as it were.
Mhm.
Like, I'm just gonna keep you company and let you feel whatever you're gonna feel. And that is, I think, the best one can do.
Right, right. Absolutely. And similarly, it also isn't, and I appreciated this, a caregiving manual.
Right,
We don't need more, not to
right,
take away from the ones that exist because there's so much value, but it is also, it's any story that we read that we resonate, any movie that touches us, even
right,
listening to a podcast, what we're drawn to is the person. And what we're drawn to is their humanity and their story and us on that journey with them. And I think that you did invite us into your experience. And so, for you, what did you hope that readers would understand emotionally or within their own story that no checklist or resource guide could teach them?
right. I, so two things. One is several things in the book are kind of like what not to do.
Mhm.
And I talk about kind of giving myself an anesthetic that lasted about 30 years. And boy, when it wore off, woof, there was hell to
Mhm.
pay.
Mhm.
And I wanted people to, and Joan Didion talks brilliantly about this. I
Mhm.
wanted people to know that there's kind of no right way to grieve. And
Mhm.
if it takes a lifetime, so
Mhm.
be it. And actually,
Mhm.
that is something it's not a how-to at all, but
Mhm.
when the moment is right, sometimes I'll say to people, like, I'm never going to get over my grief, and that's okay.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
actually and that was something I realized maybe a year ago, after writing this book,
Mhm.
that there are just some things that I will never get over. And
Mhm.
that's okay. And little things like
Mhm.
my dad, I talk about this, we're having breakfast and he has a plastic container with maple syrup to pour the syrup over his pancakes, and he doesn't realize that he needs to open it. And he's just sort of there with the plastic container unopened,
Mhm.
thinking the syrup's going to come out. I'll never get over that.
Mhm.
I just won't. And I think some people might get over that. And so that's everyone's brain, like, we're all the same, but we're all really different. And
Mhm.
I just wanted people to know that whatever their experience is, it's like, okay.
Mhm. You had shared by looking directly at the hardest memories, I've been
Yeah,
able to find the happiest ones, extending on your thoughts that you had just shared. And a lot of times we spend a lot of our life avoiding those painful
right.
memories.
Right.
And how did going back, right? Some things will never get over, but how did that become a path to healing?
I didn't know that it would.
Mm,
And I should just say that um, the last chapter of the book is it's called In Memoriam. So it's about memory. I thought that was going to be the first chapter of the book because
mm,
before I studied neurology, I thought Alzheimer's was only about memory, and it's not. And I'm sure your listeners know this very well. And it just turned out the memory chapter was the hardest one for Bruce to write, and so he put it off. But that turned out to be, as writing happens, like,
mhm,
it worked.
mhm,
And so for him, the penultimate chapter is called Behavior. And that was the hardest chapter for me to write for various reasons. And it was the easiest chapter for Bruce to write
Mm,
because his expertise is in all things dementia, but specifically frontotemporal dementia, which has
mhm,
as one of its primary the symptoms sort of behavioral issues. And
mhm,
so that's what Bruce really specializes in. And so the behavior chapter, as I said, was the hardest one for me to write. And then I was able to, in kind of looking at the terrible things that had happened,
mhm, mhm,
I was, and I don't know how this worked like psychologically, but um, I wasn't in denial about the bad things. And
mhm,
then I couldn't be in denial about the good things.
mhm,
It's
mhm,
funny, like, why would someone be in denial about the good things? Well, because when I got that phone call from my mom, time froze
mm,
and I couldn't get back to the 25 years I had with my dad
mm,
when he was healthy. And then I was able to get back to those years
mhm,
and remember all of these wonderful, funny things about my dad.
mhm,
And that was just so great to be able to remember that. Because, like, at the funeral,
mm,
um, like, I had to do a funeral again. That was the year of
mhm,
neurology. It was the year
mhm,
where I finally, in the Jewish tradition, you sit Shiva when someone dies.
mm,
And Shiva for my dad when he died was just so broken. Because
mhm.
usually you sit around and tell stories but nobody wanted to tell stories.
Yeah.
And the year with Bruce, and I say this in the preface, was, and I didn't even know it, I was
Mm,
asking him to sit Shiva with me.
wow.
And it was through doing that that I then kind of opened up my mind and could access these very precious memories that I had almost
Mm,
kind of hid from myself.
mhm,
It's too painful to
mhm,
remember how healthy he was and how happy he
mhm,
was
mhm,
given what happened.
mhm. That is such a great description of sitting Shiva again. Truly, truly going through all of that. There is language. You also describe yourself as being patched right after sitting in Shiva for a second time
Right,
with the grief and for a decade, not healed and patched.
right.
Uh, why was that the right word for you to describe that?
I'm so glad you picked up on that word
Mm-hmm.
because I spent, I remember writing that
Mm,
and it wasn't fixed
mm-hmm.
and it wasn't a new tire.
Mm, yeah.
And so a patch means that you can keep driving
Mm,
in the car,
mhm,
but there's like a scar.
mm,
And that's why it's patched.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, that does make sense. And the years ago, when your dad was diagnosed, there was little conversation. Was there any conversation around caregiving at that time?
Not that I recall.
Yeah, I
Neuro,
don't recall when
yeah,
my grandma moved in with my family when I was young, and we were caregivers for her, but we didn't use that term because we didn't have language for it. We were, your daughter,
right,
your partner, and you care for people that
right.
you love, but there wasn't any language around caregiving. Now we do have support groups and books and research and more of a conversation around it and podcasts. Two questions for you.
Mhm.
Do you feel that many caregivers still feel alone in their caregiving. I know I hear that. I feel like it is hard. We know community's there, but yet when you're in it on your own, it does feel lonely.
Mhm.
And then the second part of that question is, why do you think that is?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Uh, so I touched on it a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and that just to um, remind listeners that I
Mm-hmm.
think it's lonely because you don't want to inflict your pain
Yeah.
on people that you're spending a lot of time with, that
Mm-hmm.
there's only so much
Mm-hmm.
that I think
Mm-hmm.
the best intention people,
Mm-hmm.
can take,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and what I want to also say is that for caregivers, um, so one of the presentations that my dad had with dementia was depression.
Mm,
And Bruce, my co-author, has a hypothesis that depression isn't necessarily the reaction to dementia, but a feature
mm.
of it.
Wow.
And so it's one of these risk factors that can be addressed, not necessarily to stave off the disease, but
Mhm.
to delay it. And there are other modifiable risk factors we can talk about.
Mm,
And I think that it's important for the caregiver to think about their own state of mind
mhm.
and to what extent their loneliness could be feeding into depression.
Right.
And it's very important. I always tell caregivers this, that you go to the doctor
Mm,
and make sure you take care of yourself.
mm,
And when you have an opportunity to sort of fill in that line at the bottom of the form, anything else you'd like to tell your doctor, tell
mhm.
them you're a caregiver,
Mm,
because that is a job, maybe a second job.
mhm.
And I think that loneliness is part of it. My mom, I think, handled her loneliness by throwing herself into the temple. And I think for people who are religious, that can be
Mhm.
really valuable. Um, so so there are outlets, but I think there
Mhm.
is a fundamental loneliness that
Mhm. Mhm.
you maybe can't fix.
Mhm.
Um, Except it might be moderated if
Mhm.
it's turning into, like a depression.
Yeah.
Um, so I encourage caregivers to
Mhm.
just make sure that however, however they're feeling, that the doctor knows.
Mhm. Absolutely. I
Yeah.
appreciate you speaking on that. I think it's an important reminder to be aware of our mental health and
Yeah,
where we need support in that. Yeah.
right.
For you, did you turn to literature for your, uh, I don't know, fighting that loneliness in a way? Or tell me, this
Mhm.
is personally like, I'm curious what stories or poetry helped
Mhm.
you in this process, whether it
Right,
was giving support and escape. Would just
right,
love to hear you share.
right.
Yeah.
Well, literature helped and didn't.
Mhm.
What I did was I threw myself into being the best graduate student I could be.
Mhm.
And uh, I was so happy reading about other people's pain. Like in Moby Dick and Scarlet
Mhm.
Letter and Edgar Allan Poe
Mhm.
stories, that it gave me a reprieve from my own.
Mhm. Mhm.
And my sort of, I mentioned sort of my go-to authors. And I thought a lot about Hester Prynne and the Scarlet Letter, and
Mhm.
how in writing this book with Bruce, I wanted to make something beautiful out of something sorrowful. And that's what Hester does with her A.
Mhm.
And I I read both to hide from how I was feeling.
Mhm.
And then when I was done reading and I would go to bed, the elephant on my chest would wake
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
and and yet also books kind of like opened a window into how I was feeling.
Mhm.
So it was like a both and sort of
Mhm.
situation. And
Mhm.
that's my answer.
Yeah. So good. There is so much about having the reprieve from our thoughts at times, but also needing time to process and be in them as well, you
Right,
know?
right.
Yeah. When you think about your dad today, and
Uh-huh.
I'm sure there's so much that shapes your life, what parts of him shape the way you live and love and parent and move through this world?
So there's a lot.
Mhm.
With respect to my family, I, at the very beginning of our discussion, you mentioned the letter that my dad sent to me
Mhm.
that made me feel so loved and seen and
Mhm.
appreciated.
Mhm.
And I try very hard with my own children to have that kind of relationship.
Mhm.
He took incredible care of my mother, and I try my best to take care of my husband.
Mhm.
Uh, he loved our dog. I love our dog.
Mhm. Yes.
Then I think just trying to be generous,
Mhm.
that's huge. And I think maybe the most important thing is I know that he wouldn't want people to suffer the way he did.
Mhm. Mhm.
And to the extent that I do podcasts like this and support groups,
Mhm.
and that's what my dad would want.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I keep doing it. I do it because I want to help people. I do it in honor of my dad.
Yeah, I'm so thankful for that.
Thank you.
It's a gift to all of us when we can now meet you and have you in our world and have your compassion and your generosity. It is the ripple effect of his legacy that will continue, and your children will be inspired in the same way. And generations after that. It's so, so incredible when we can see that and reflect on that. And I'm thankful you're here. So I appreciate
Well,
that. Yeah. Please tell us where we can purchase your book, learn more about you, connect, all of that.
Ah, I the book is with Johns Hopkins University Press, so you can get it through them. Hilarity for Charity has a bookshelf, and a certain amount of the proceeds from the books on the HFC website um, go to HFC to support caregivers. Obviously, Amazon.com. I have a website, cindyw.phd. I think that's what it's called.
Amazing. I'll include it all. Yeah.
Okay, that would be great.
Yeah.
It has things about the memoir, about my more academic books, and
Mhm.
some things about the new memoir that I'm writing, which is about
Mhm.
gardening.
Mm.
Yeah.
Amazing. I'll include all of that. And I love that you are working with HFC. I have some really dear friends, some girlfriends that
Mhm.
are part of the care squad over at
Oh, yeah.
HFC. Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's such an
Adria
amazing.
Thompson and Carrie Albers, Dementia Darling and Be Like Care and Jessica
Yeah.
Guthrie and all those
Yeah.
amazing women. So
Yes.
great,
Yes.
great group.
Agreed. Agreed.
Oh, I love that. Well, thank you. Have
Thank you so
such
much,
an
Nicole.
incredible time this summer. I know you are in California, so you're probably enjoying all of this beautiful weather, but we
Yeah. Thank
appreciate
you.
you. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much, Nicole. It's really been such a gift talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.